I used to think that being a parent meant doing everything right, from how I taught my child to even the smallest daily habits. But it wasn't until my child turned 3 that I realized how many important things I hadn't known sooner. In those early years, I was exhausted from trying to be perfect, while what my child needed most was my presence and connection. Everything happened so fast in the most ordinary moments at home, and only when I looked back did I truly understand. This video is a collection of the things I wish I had known earlier for anyone raising a young child and carrying the same questions I once did. Lesson 1: I wish I had known earlier that connection matters more than perfection. There was a time when I thought being a parent meant doing everything right. Right meal times, right bedtime, right methods. I read a lot, took endless notes, and constantly worried that I was doing something wrong. But the harder I tried to be perfect, the more exhausted I became. And my child became exhausted too. There were evenings when I did everything by the book: a nutritious meal, age-appropriate toys, a clear daily routine, and yet my child still cried, still clung to me, still refused to sleep. I kept thinking, what am I still missing? Only much later did I understand my child didn't need me to be perfect, like the books said. My child needed me to truly be there. Not there with a head full of worries, but there with my eyes, my attention, my arms. On the days when I put the to-do list aside, sat down to play, listened to my child's babbling, held my child, while they cried without rushing to make it stop, those were the days my child calmed down the fastest. I realized something very simple, but far too late for a child: the feeling of being connected matters more than any kind of perfection. If only I had known that sooner, maybe I would have blamed myself less and enjoyed those early years of parenthood a little more. Lesson 2: I didn't know that the first 3 years matter so much. Back then, I thought my child was too young to remember anything. I believed I could wait until my child was older before I really started to teach them. But the first 3 years passed so quickly that I barely noticed. Every day, my child was growing through the smallest things: the familiar sound of my voice, the way I looked at them, how I responded when they cried or laughed. Only later did I understand that those seemingly ordinary moments were quietly building the foundation for who my child would become. Not through lessons, but through a sense of safety. Not through instruction, but through my repeated presence day after day. If only I had known earlier that every hug, every time I responded to my child, was helping shape the person they would one day be. If this resonates with you, feel free to leave a comment and share how it made you feel. And if you'd like to keep reflecting on this journey with me, don't forget to follow the channel for the next lessons. Lesson 3: I used to think my child was giving me a hard time, but in reality, my child was having a hard time. There were days when my child cried for a long time over something that seemed so small and I couldn't understand why. I used to think my child was being stubborn, deliberately testing my limits, and that belief made me far more exhausted. It wasn't until I slowed down and truly observed my child that I realized they weren't trying to make things difficult for me at all. They were simply facing emotions that were too big for their capacity. They didn't yet know how to name what they were feeling nor how to calm themselves down. When I stopped blaming my child and started staying with them with more patience, those crying spells stopped being battles. They became reminders that in those moments, my child needed understanding far more than control. Lesson 4: I didn't realize how much my calmness affected my child. In the past, whenever my child cried loudly or lost control, I often reacted on instinct. I spoke faster, raised my voice, and wanted the crying to stop as quickly as possible. But that almost never worked. Gradually, I began to notice that when I was tense, my child became even more overwhelmed. And when I consciously slowed down, lowered my voice, and stayed calm, my child settled too, almost naturally. I came to understand that in moments when my child couldn't regulate their own emotions, they were borrowing my calmness to find balance again. And that was something I had never realized before. Lesson 5: I used to think play was just for fun, but for my child, it's how learning happens. There was a time when I felt guilty spending so much time just playing with my child. I thought I should be teaching them something more instead of sitting there repeating simple, sometimes boring games. But then I started to notice that during play, my child was learning how to wait their turn, how to cope when things didn't go their way, and how to connect with me in a very natural way. There was no pressure, no right or wrong, only curiosity and joy. I realized that play isn't leftover time in the day. For a child, it is the most important work of childhood. If you've read this far and feel a sense of connection, leave a 1 in the comments so I know I'm not alone on this journey. Lesson 6. I wish I had been more patient and let my child do things on their own. There were so many times when I did things for my child simply because I wanted everything to move faster. On rushed mornings, I put their shoes on for them. When they struggled to put toys away, I cleaned up to keep things tidy. I thought I was helping, but in reality, I was taking away some very important opportunities. Later, I realized that every time my child said, "Let me do it," it wasn't stubbornness. It was a desire to try to make mistakes and to feel capable. Even when it was slow and messy, those moments were helping my child build confidence from the inside out. When I learned to slow down to accept a messier house and slightly longer mornings, I began to see a change. My child was happier finishing things on their own, and their eyes lit up with pride. If only I had known earlier that loving a child isn't about doing things for them, but about giving them the chance to do things themselves to grow in their own way. Lesson 7. I used to be afraid my child would be bored, but it turns out they really need empty space. In the past, whenever my child said they were bored, I immediately felt anxious. I worried they weren't happy, worried I wasn't doing enough, and rushed to fill their time with toys, activities, or screens. I thought that was what was best for them. But then I started to observe more closely the moments when I didn't intervene. In those stretches of time when nothing special was happening, my child began to invent their own games. They arranged familiar objects in new ways, talked to themselves, and created an entire world of their own. I realized that boredom isn't something to avoid, it's space for a child's imagination to open up. When everything isn't pre-planned, children learn how to solve problems on their own and discover how to create joy for themselves. If only I had known earlier that I don't always need to do something for my child. Sometimes the best thing I can do is step back, observe, and trust that my child can explore the world at their own pace. Lesson 8. I used to be afraid that loving too much would make my child dependent. There was a time when I hesitated every time my child cried. I wondered whether I should respond right away or let them get used to it. I worried that if I always held my child and responded to them, they would become weak or overly dependent on me. But reality turned out to be very different. Each time I showed up for my child consistently, they gradually became calmer. They cried less, and when they didn't see me right away, they no longer panicked the way they used to. I realized that my presence wasn't making my child weaker, it was helping them feel safe. When a child knows that someone is always there, they feel brave enough to step a little farther away to try new things and to become independent in their own way. That sense of safety is like an invisible anchor, allowing a child to grow stronger. If only I had understood sooner that loving and responding to a child is not spoiling them. It is how we build a solid foundation so they can walk their own path with confidence. Lesson 9. I used to think discipline was about obedience, but it's really about understanding. In the past, whenever my child did something wrong, my first instinct was to make them stop immediately. I thought discipline meant being strict, correcting behavior as quickly as possible so it wouldn't happen again. But the more I tried to control things, the more distance I felt growing between us. My child either went silent or pushed back without truly understanding what was happening inside them. Later on, I began to shift my perspective. I realized that discipline isn't meant to make a child afraid, it's meant to help them learn. To learn how to name their feelings, how to regulate their behavior, and how to know that even when they make mistakes, they are still loved. When I spoke more slowly, listened more, and guided instead of punished, my child cooperated more naturally. And I came to understand that what my child needed wasn't control but guidance. Lesson 10, I didn't know that clear boundaries actually help my child feel safer. For a long time, whenever I said no to my child, I explained everything in great detail. I hoped my child would understand, cooperate, and react less strongly. But the more I talked, the more confusing things became. My child cried more, and I ended up exhausted from arguing with a child who simply wasn't developmentally ready to grasp all those reasons. Gradually, I realized that my child didn't need long explanations. What they needed was clarity and consistency. When I said no calmly, briefly, and held the boundary firmly, my child reacted far less intensely than I had expected. I came to understand that boundaries aren't about controlling a child, they're about helping a child know what is safe and what the limits are. And it's that clarity that helps a child feel more secure in a world that is still so new to them. Lesson 11. The most important thing I learned was to trust that I had done enough. There were so many moments when I questioned whether I was doing things right. I compared myself to advice online, to other families, and to some image of an ideal parent I carried in my head. But when I look back on the journey, I realize my child never needed me to get everything right. My child only needed me to keep coming back to be willing to learn again and to love them in the most genuine way I could. The mistakes, the exhaustion, the days when I didn't show up the way I hoped, all of that is a very real part of the parenting journey. If only I had known earlier that trusting myself is just as important as trusting my child, maybe I would have doubted myself less and carried my heart a little more lightly. When my child turned 3, I realized that I never needed to do everything perfectly the way I once believed. What my child remembers and carries forward isn't how many things I did right, but the sense of safety they felt when they were with me. If you've made it this far and see yourself somewhere in these stories, leave a comment so I know we're not alone on this parenting journey. And if you'd like to keep reflecting together, sharing, and learning how to carry things more lightly each day, follow the channel, and I'll see you in the next videos.